afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our discussion, Elections in Georgia and Moldova, What Next for the Accession Path? My name is Mariam Khotanashvili, and I'm the Executive Director of TEPSA. 3 weeks ago in Moldova, the Yes campaign achieved a narrow victory in the constitutional referendum on pursuing the EU path. And last Sunday, the pro-Western Maya Sandu secured her second presidential term in the second round of elections. However, both the elections and the referendum were marked by massive Russian meddling, including disinformation and vote buying at a large scale. So the challenge is not yet over. Parliamentary elections in Moldova will be held in spring 2025, and these elections will be no less important than the presidential elections, in the sense that the parliament will need to vote on numerous reforms required in Moldova's accession process. Now, across the Black Sea, Georgia already has this aspiration of Euro-Atlantic integration enshrined in the constitution, but this has not prevented the Georgian government from acting against Georgia's European future. Georgian parliamentary elections of 26th of October were marred by irregularities, including carousel voting, including violations of vote secrecy, vote buying, and large-scale intimidation. So the legitimacy of the election's outcome is likely to be contested as the ruling party is seeking to move on and obviously to stay in power. Our question is, how has the EU responded? Maya Sandu's re-election and win in the Moldovan referendum were met with relief and warm congratulations. In case of Georgia, EU leaders seem reluctant to acknowledge and to say it loud that Georgia's elections were rigged. 14 ministers have issued a statement condemning the violations of international norms. Just recently, the leaders of France, Germany, and Poland have also declared their concerns, but these declarations do not state clearly that the official 54% victory of Georgian Dream is illegitimate and will not be recognized. EU leaders seem to be mostly buying time and calling for investigations, national dialogue, and waiting for the final report of international observers. Now, it was highly predictable that the Georgian government would manipulate the parliamentary elections as much as needed to stay in power, but the EU at that stage only supported a standard-sized election monitoring mission within the framework of OSCE ODR. This was, I think, quite a naive approach if the EU wanted to be effective and prepared. Now, the post-election reactions give us an impression that the EU prefers to downplay the problem and not to have to deal with it in a way. So this obviously raises the questions how the EU will ever act against democratic backsliding if it doesn't act now in the wake of what I would call stolen elections in a candidate country. Our guests today are Elena Panciulidze, Research Coordinator at the European Partnership for Democracy, EPD, Iulian Groza, Executive Director at the Institute for European Policies and Reforms in Moldova, and Professor Giselle Bos, Jean Monnet Chair as well at the Maastricht University. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us this afternoon. And I'd like to start with Iulian, please. And let's start with Moldova. What was the magnitude and impact of Russia's interference, both during the referendum and during the presidential elections? And what are the prospects for the upcoming parliamentary elections?
Thank you very much. Very glad to be here with all of you. Thanks for TEPSA for organizing this timely debate. Indeed, Moldova has been reconfirming its European track through two electoral exercises. Very important, the constitutional referendum, because it was for the first time when Moldovan citizens were invited to make a legislative decision to amend our constitution. And now, even with the results on the edge, we secured that majority of the citizens of Moldova support Moldova's European accession. I think it's a very good and important and timely instrument to set a milestone towards our objective as a country to be ready to join the European Union by 2030. And of course, with the presidential elections reconfirming that, because we had geopolitical elections in terms of the presidential choices, like presidential candidate choices, it was really about pro-EU or at least ambivalent, not really EU, but more pro-Russian narratives, at least looking at those who have been supporting the counter candidate that lost these elections. So about the Russia's interference, it's not a surprise, and it's not a news today that Russia is conducting diverse malign influences across Europe, I would say even globally. And we have seen how Russia is being interfering in various electoral processes already for years, but now, of course, Moldova has been a target of hybrid aggression of Russia for some time. And we have seen how Russia is trying to use not only disinformation or cyber attacks, but also proxies, even criminals to conduct malign interferences and attacking actually democratic processes. We had already for over 1 year, already 1 year and a half, a series of elections, regional, local elections, in the last year, and we have seen how that happened. Of course, the attacks and interferences we have seen in these months with the referendum and the constitution was unprecedented. We have seen, beyond disinformation, beyond use of the social networks, TikTok, Telegram, Meta, as well to conduct these false types of information campaigns, disinformation campaigns, but also an unprecedented scheme, pyramid scheme, criminal scheme of vote buying, where at least 130,000 citizens of Moldova, if not more, because the figures are different, is still under investigation. Both the police and investigative journalists have actually shown how this scheme has worked, and it was unprecedented. Basically, over 50 million euros or dollars have been invested only in vote buying in the last few months through these schemes, through Russian banks. And yeah, this is an example where even international sanctions on Russian banks or criminals are not entirely efficient when you look at how it has operated over the last time. But I think at the end of the day, what we have managed to prove is that the entire effort that has been invested in increasing Moldova's resilience, societal resilience, is starting to give some results. At least when you look at the results of the vote, you'd see that despite this, malign interferences, illegal vote buying, and everything else, still we got the majority of the citizens that have been very much aware about the stakes of this referendum and the elections. And they showed at the ballots and in unprecedented numbers. And I think what it is important, if you look at the referendum, is that we got the majority of the citizens have participated in this referendum, of those who have the right to vote. And out of them, the majority voted yes. And with the presidential elections, as I mentioned at the very beginning, it was indeed a geopolitical vote. And I think it reconfirmed the pro-European aspirations of Moldovan citizens in larger numbers. So now with the, of course, expectations for the current president to take the position of the president for the next 4 years, with a clear objective of Moldova being brought to the European Union, using the whole opportunities that the European Union and Commission is providing on the enlargement process, saying very clear that in the next mandate of the European Commission, we will see new members coming. This is a great opportunity for us, and for us, it is important to make sure that we fit in the calendar of negotiations, but more importantly, to make sure that we have a government, stable government in the next 4 years, able to conduct negotiations, able to resist continuous hybrid warfare aggression of Russia, and at the same time address vulnerabilities that were exposed throughout this electoral year. So parliamentary elections, that is the answer. It will happen next year. We don't know exactly when, but it is clear that we will be in a position to face a third wave of basically interferences of Russia, and a third wave that Moldovan citizens will have to resist to. And I think there is a lot of things to happen until that time. The president made a clear commitment following the results of the vote that some of the reshufflements have to be conducted in terms of executive policies, agenda. Some of the priorities need to be adjusted. More should be focused on making the justice reform becoming even more efficient, producing impact. A lot of work still has to be done to outreach to the vulnerabilities or to vulnerable communities that have been unfortunately exposed to malign influences, and see how we can reach to those part of the population to make sure that they are not only informed but are also becoming more resilient against any types of illegal operations. So we don't know now, of course, what will happen, but what's sure is that all political parties, irrespective, we talk about the governing party today, or the opposition parties, will have to adjust their strategies. And it is clear that for us, for the citizens of Moldova, it is very important to have pro-European parties, pro-reform parties, to win a majority in the next parliament. We don't know whether the current governing majority will secure its majority presence in the parliament. Possibly yes, possibly not, but still unlikely, because it was rather an exception on the fact that 4 years ago, the parliament managed to get the majority of the pro-European party governing today. So it's very likely that we will have a coalition government. And now, of course, our preoccupation as citizens is making sure that political parties reinvent themselves or prioritize definitely the accession agenda, because this is a great opportunity for the whole country to secure its presence in the European Union. And here, of course, as we just heard yesterday in statements of the EU leaders on the margins of the European Political Community Summit, EU will stay with Moldova further and will provide additional support to address all these challenges and to make sure that Moldova is further increasing its capacity to resist to any type of illegal malign influences of Russia. Stop here.
Thank you very much, Julian. We'll come back to Moldova's case, also include in the question and answers. Now I'll move to Elene. Elene, in Georgia, what was the scale of irregularities in Georgian parliamentary elections? It seems that political assessments are put on hold as the EU is waiting for this final ODI report. What do you think can we expect from the report, and how would you evaluate the interim report, and how about Georgian civil society's efforts to investigate the irregularities?
Thank you, Mariam, and thanks for TAPSA for organizing this timely discussion. And I think the issue of the scale is a critical one because irregularities are not unusual thing for electoral processes. But the question is whether these irregularities had a systemic and a widespread character in elections that could potentially impact the outcome of the election and undermine the public trust and international trust in the legitimacy of the elections. Now let's talk about a list of irregularities that are part of the preliminary conclusions of the international election observation missions that you just mentioned that were led by OSCE-OD. Voter pressure, extensive voter tracking, compromises in voter secrecy, tension or unrest inside polling stations, procedural inaccuracies, including violations of inking process. And just to explain for the audience, the inking process is a very important and fundamental one because this ensures that each voter can only vote once at particular polling station and participate in elections and give the vote once in particular elections. And these are just a very few of systemic irregularities that we see in in the reports of the International Election Observation Mission. Now let's talk about the numbers to have the overview of the scale of these irregularities. And I will start with the one that is related to the secrecy of votes, because local observers, Georgian Young Lawyers Association, challenged this particular violation during elections into the courts. To explain to the audience, this year, for the first time, voting was conducted using new technologies. And in the 90% of voters did cast their ballots with this use of new technology. And according to the local observers, Young Lawyers Association, and my vote, this particular fundamental issue of the voter secrecy was blatantly violated during the elections because it clearly showed on the back of the ballot what was the choice of the particular citizen. And given the fact that 90% of the votes were cast electronically using these new technologies, I think that this is likely the largest scale violation witnessed in 2020 parliamentary elections in Georgia. In addition to the secrecy of votes, and I move to the second part of the evidences that are related to the scale of the irregularities in Georgian elections, then a very same election observation missions called My Vote, and for the audience, I think lots of people are interested about the evidence of these irregularities. They also created an English language, both Georgian and English language websites, and they provided the evidence of more than 370 photos and video material of these very irregularities that are mentioned, both international and local observation missions. And they are talking about, they have filed the complaints to and are requesting the annulment of the results from 246 precincts. And the overall number of voters in these challenged precincts is over 400,000. And just to clarify for the audience, just over 2 million citizens, according to the official data that is provided by Central Election Commission, just over 2 million citizens voted in 2024 parliamentary elections. Talking about the votes of more than 400,000 voters, this is about 20% of overall votes that were cast during the election day. So the scale is a very significant one. The last one that I want to talk about that proves some of the irregularities during the elections are statistical inaccuracies. And here we have both international dimension and local dimension. Again, we had Harrisix, this is a US polling company that conducted the exit polls. And yesterday, a local observer organization, ISFED, also published their reports where they did the gender analysis. And both reports proved that there were potentially inexplainable discrepancies in the statistical analysis. To explain for the audience, for example, in the ISPED's report yesterday, it proves that the number of the males that voted in lots of polling stations exceeded the number of total male voters that were registered for particular polling stations. It is theoretically very difficult to believe that 100% of voters showed up to elections to vote, but having more than 100% of male voters showing up to vote in election, this definitely proves that we are talking about the significant irregularities, either in the data or the violations that were related to this day. And I want to conclude my remarks because I think it is important to note that talking about these irregularities is not about proving that Georgian Dream doesn't have supporters in Georgia, but we're talking about also protecting the right, constitutional right of those voters who voted for other political parties and who voted for the multi-party government and multi-party political system in Georgia. And it is very, very important to protect the right of these voters. And last sentence that I will say about the international response and support to local organizations, media and civil society organizations, I think it is very challenging, and it is very challenging not linked to the elections, but to the legislation that the Georgian authorities adopted just before several months before the elections. And I'm talking about the transparency of foreign influence legislation that does not allow the European Union, in line with other international donors, to provide democracy support to local civil society and media organizations. So the picture is very gloomy and very depressing at the moment. Thank you, Mariam.
Thank you very much, Elena. That really reveals the magnitude of irregularities and links very well to my Next question to Giselle. Giselle, we have seen some tweets and statements from the EU leaders on the situation, but mostly, calling for Georgian leadership for proper investigation and return to the European path. However, it has been quite clear for many months that Georgia Dream is not going to reverse its course. And it's obvious that they do not have an interest in reversing the outcome of the elections, which they rigged in the first place. So just yesterday, the Prime Minister of Georgia was standing next to EU leaders at the EPC, European Political Community Summit in Budapest. In your view, what can the EU do to avoid Georgia's further democratic backsliding? Should there be an attempt at an EU-led investigation into recent elections? Should the EU or a majority of its member states declare the outcome of Georgian parliamentary elections illegitimate? Should there be sanctions, and if yes, how? How about support of civil society and media in Georgia going forward? And what tools does the EU have to protect a candidate country from election rigging? Many questions, but we would love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariam. These are indeed, not so easy questions, and I'm afraid I probably don't add to the, to a more optimistic picture of the situation. I mean, as you already mentioned, I think there are two major issues. I would argue, that are very critical for what the EU can actually do. To avoid further democratic backsliding in Georgia. Now, it's probably not even the availability of the EU's tools. I think the EU's toolbox is relatively complex, and there would be sufficient tools to address the situation. And I want to mention a few in a second. But there are two other major issues. One is, of course, are member states sufficiently united and willing to take action? And, as we've just seen at the summit, I think that's fairly illustrative of the situation, that here there's neither unity nor particular urgency to address the situation. And I think that reflects not very positively on the EU in this particular circumstance. It certainly doesn't match its rhetoric, for example, that there was before the Georgian elections. And the second issue is, of course, what kind of leverage does the EU actually have over the Georgian government? And there are certainly some areas of leverage, and I want to mention a few as well. But we also have to be aware of the fact that increasingly Georgia is, of course, also looking to China, is looking to the Russian Federation, is looking to Turkey. And has this multi-vector foreign policy, if you want to call it that way, and that also reduces the EU's leverage in some way. So let me then perhaps first very briefly talk about these areas of leverage that I believe that there still are, and that the EU should actually use. Of course, on the one hand, we have the trade partnership that is of significance. The EU is still Georgia's main trading partner. Still makes up about just over 20% of Georgia's total trade. We of course have a deep and comprehensive free trade area agreement still in place that gradually also increases Georgia's market access to the European Union. And when it comes to EU investments, the EU is also still the largest provider of foreign direct investment in Georgia. And there's an economic and investment plan of over 3 billion euros, also leveraged by the European Union to boost investments. So that is important. The other area, but here also the EU's share in Georgia's exports is declining. And that is a trend that is likely to continue, and that means less and less leverage of the EU. A second big area of EU leverage, arguably, is the budget support. They will also be aware of this, of course, that the EU has invested heavily in direct budget support to the Georgian government in a variety of areas, whether that's now economic reforms, infrastructure projects, and other direct budget support. And this is massive. And here, of course, the Commission already has frozen some funds, but a very, very limited amount in comparison to the the overall sum that is involved. And then the third area of leverage that of course concerns people in Georgia, and still 80% of Georgians who support EU accession, and that is another very significant source of potential influence. Now then we also have the security dimension, but here, as you probably know yourself, I think the EU provision of security guarantees is, relatively limited. But of course, there's a question of NATO membership. And I think if one wants to increase some kind of leverage, then this NATO membership perspective, or at least more sincere security guarantees, would potentially also make some kind of difference. But as said before, there's Russia, there's Turkey, and there's China. And when you travel in the country, you also see this very, very clearly, that the orientation also economically in terms of infrastructure and building is very much also focused on Chinese trade routes, and also towards the Russian Federation. Let's maybe say, what could the EU do? Of course, there are several tools. When we look at the DCFTA, one could, for example, also look at some of the benefits that there are with the DCFTA, that there could be some more restrictions being introduced, perhaps not across the board, but for example, in sectors controlled by oligarchs, or one particular oligarch that you, of course, are all aware of. Perhaps not funding that goes to education or small and medium-sized businesses, for example. So here one could be relatively targeted. Of course, more suspension of funding for specific government projects that should also be involved. There's definitely a range that the EU could definitely still make use of, and you can escalate this, of course, within the DCFTA and reduce the benefits if you wanted to. Secondly, there could also be the enlargement process tools, of course, that could at the moment, of course, is a frozen situation when it comes to the candidacy status. But ultimately, there can be a review of the candidate status and the withdrawal potentially. But one would need to have a plan for that too. That the EU clearly communicates, at what point is this red line being crossed, but none of this has obviously happened. So we just still have a sort of a de facto frozen candidacy status, but no further communication of red lines or when and how this could in detail be lifted. And then you have sanctions, and you mentioned this before as well. The European Parliament, of course, has called for personal sanctions against individuals, including Ivanishvili, asset freezes. That is, something that can be considered, but I haven't, heard that from any other actors within the European Union. Of course, for this you also need unity. And I think we know already one country, if not two, like Hungary and Slovakia, who would oppose these sanctions directly. So, and perhaps it's something done maybe even better in an international context. So if one would get an international coalition that would agree on imposing sanctions, as it was in the context of the Russian Federation, of course, that would make it, I guess, also a bit easier for the EU to find a consensus on such sanctions. But I take into account the EU's unity or disunity on the issue at the moment, I don't immediately see this happening. Last point is also visa and travel related measures. Of course, here there was talk about reviewing or suspending the entire visa liberalization process. But that, of course, would also hit generally the Georgian population. So could be limited to a travel ban, again, for those responsible for de-democratization, or partial visa is sort of a partial visa suspension. But again, one would need some kind of consensus amongst member states. And maybe the last 2 points on the available tools, and it was mentioned before, the EU has certainly more tools available to monitor, or at least also to invest in monitoring elections before, during, and after the elections. But the one biggest problem here is that the target government would have to agree. So European election observation missions, also the international ones, always come upon invitation from the government, right? And that is the main obstacle, of course, for the EU to get further involved here as well.
But although they could suggest,
yes,
and we haven't seen that yet, right?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they could also put some pressure and say allow, a more intensive or election monitoring, already pre-election monitoring, by the way, or now more independent audits that the EU could also fund through civil society, and has done this in other contexts as well. And I think the EU would have the leverage if it had a plan, which I don't think it does, in order then to, ask for these concessions. But, I don't think this has happened. And then there's the, last but not least, I think if, the EU always talks about being geopolitical, and there's this debate, of course, in this context now, I guess, as well. But I think ultimately also, how the EU, but also the US fares in the context of the Russian war against Ukraine is very important here. So I think there would be a massive increase, I think, in credibility and also in leverage if the West would have a certain or more assertive sort of intervention into the Russian war against Ukraine, and if they would help Ukraine to prevail or win, that would definitely make a difference, I would say, on the also for the Georgian government. But that we can argue about this. Maybe a very last two very quick points. And you mentioned this. Should the EU, should there be this EU-led investigation? Again, usually the EU only does that if invited by the host government. But I would argue it could have used some of its leverage to be invited, or to persuade the Georgian government to do a bit more than is currently being asked for. But just look at the rhetoric of the EU. It's not even clear what kind of independent investigation they are asking for. At the moment, this is just, can the Georgian government, the electoral commission, look into the situation, and the prosecutor's office. But they are not even very clear as the EU. They say an independent investigation, but what is this? International investigation? It is not independent when we are asking the Georgian government. That's obvious, right? So, but the rhetoric here is not very clear, and I think there already the problem starts. Lastly, EU declaring elections illegitimate. Yeah, that's also something they don't do very often. One has to say, they did it though recently in Venezuela. In 2024, to all EU 27 jointly, there was full agreement. Also 2020 Belarus, 2021 Nicaragua, also 2020 Burundi. Now, but not now in the context of Georgia. You can say what kind of irregularities were there, where they just, they were not very violent. You didn't see police brutality very visibly in front of your face. Of course, it was also there. Intimidation was there, but not as visible. And perhaps also not as bad as in the context of Belarus or elsewhere. But also it's about the international support. What is really relevant. We had there was, of course, also other issues in the Middle East and the US elections. And there's, of course, geopolitics. We know that the EU, some countries, it recognizes that the elections are illegitimate. In other contexts, like, for example, Egypt, Russia, several African countries, it doesn't. So, of course, geopolitics matters, and member state consensus very much as well. So I would say, I think the EU certainly has sufficient tools. It would just need a plan to use it, and use these tools, and have some kind of scenario planning in place. And also think about, clearly communicate to the Georgian government, well, these are the red lines. If you don't do this investigation, we will do that, or the steps that they are going to take. And I think this clear communication on red lines and future steps would help a lot already to, I think, make it a bit clearer or use the leverage that the EU actually does. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Giselle. Elena, Julian, well, at times, it feels that although the EU has relaunched its enlargement policy, as Giselle said, it doesn't always employ the tools at its disposal. So in a way, Moldova was lucky to have a pro-Western government in power. So despite massive Russian interference, free elections were still guaranteed. But what if the reverse was the case, as in Georgia? And so my question to you is very similar, to follow up perhaps what Giselle said, is the EU really acting geostrategically in the neighborhood? Or is the EU's enlargement policy a fair weather process where the burden of Russian interference, both military and hybrid, remains on the candidates' shoulders? How much tangible support does Moldova receive from the EU, and what is being done in Georgia?
Moldova is a frontline state. We have a war going on a few tens of kilometers from our border. We feel the war. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian fellows have running from the war since the war. Many of them relocated here now. Moldova had to face a lot of crises and impact of the war, of course, the humanitarian crisis, the energy crisis, a lot of them to deal with. And indeed, Moldova was lucky that Moldova was not alone. But Moldova had to build on what we have. And you mentioned correctly, I think it was a very good, a very important factor to make a difference today is, of course, the fact that we had a president that was credible enough to not only to its own citizens, but more importantly to international leaders. And Moldova has been benefiting from increased political and financial support to face the unprecedented crises and interferences of Russia, meddling in internal affairs in Moldova, undermining our, democratic processes. Just to mention a few, a lot of these kleptocrats and oligarchs are being on international sanctions. US, EU, UK, Canada, a lot of countries have put the kleptocrats on the sanctions list. And not only them, a lot of entities and organizations that have been involved in destabilization of Moldova or conducting operations undermining our sovereignty or territorial integrity or conducting criminal types of operations have been also put on the list. And on top of it, of course, Moldova is very much looking forward to advance its accession process. And all this, for now, I think for us was possible also thanks to the fact that the Ukrainian army and Ukrainian citizens, Ukraine is defending itself, but Ukraine is defending us for sure. Not only, the rest of the Eastern Europe, but for us for sure, because we have also a breakaway region with the illegal military presence of Russia, with one of the largest munitions depot in Southeastern Europe, which indeed poses a lot of risks, not only for security, but also for people in the very close proximity with the war. But so far, so good. We managed to receive I would say fast-track type of support. Just to name one, hybrid warfare was indeed a priority to deal with in Moldova, and Moldova, of course, could not deal with it by itself. And in 2023, in February, 1 year after the war started, Moldovan government asked the EU to open a CSDP mission. It was open in less than 2 months. They decided in May already for 1 year and a half, a EU CSDP mission with a mandate to help Moldova to fight hybrid warfare of Russia is here. And of course, today Moldova is much more prepared than 1 year and a half ago. Our institutions are much more prepared to face these challenges. But it's also true that Russia is adapting, is having a very flexible types of tactics and strategies. They aim for their main goal, and they adapt, and they have unlimited resources. And unfortunately, international sanctions is not as how I should say, something that would stop the operations, hybrid warfare operations, not only in Moldova, but I would say also across Europe. We have seen a lot of signals showing how Russia is meddling and interfering in the electoral processes in many other countries. Georgia is a bit far from here, but of course, I think faces the same threats. Unfortunately, Georgia has been not very helpful in stopping sanctions avoiding from Russia on Russia. We understood that was the choice of the government. We understood the reasons. Okay, but the price is that unfortunately, in a matter of time, we have seen how the democratic situation in Georgia has been going down. And I was really surprised now, actually, to read one of the statements of Prime Minister Kovahidze, teaching us and preaching us how good were elections in Georgia compared them with Moldova, signaling the fact that our ballot boxes are not in the envelope, and everyone could see that. And the elections in Georgia were much better than in Moldova and US. So that is the standards we are compared to. I will not go into details of it, but it's clear that in our case, it's not only the fact that we have a president who is very much honest, pro-reform, credible, and managed to secure a very strong mandate after 4 years of critical environment, and the government had to deal with a lot of crises, and despite of that, managed to secure that support. But I think that is not only thanks to that. I think that was possible also to the fact of the way how the society in Moldova started to mobilize itself, because our civil society became very vibrant, very active, and I think part of the whole effort to increase our societal resilience, together with independent media, and that made a difference, in particular in this unprecedented, disinformation activities on the referendum. We made a united effort, basically, to outreach out to our communities, to go and talk and explain, and try to debunk, and conduct even stratcom campaigns to increase our resilience as a society. And I think that was also very important. This has to be the basis, and this will be the basis for the next electoral processes in Moldova. And I think now we have a lot of lessons to learn after these elections. I think the president has a clear mandate and a legitimate mandate, not only to bring Moldova to the EU, but to make sure that we have in the next year a stable government, a pro-reform, pro-European government formed by various parties, so to be very much inclusive, but pro-reform, and to address the vulnerabilities and the challenges that we still face. And I think the accession process with the European Union is very much helpful because it provides a clear roadmap for that. More importantly, I think you asked how EU has helped. I mean, in a matter of 3 months, basically, European Commission has developed a growth plan, economic growth plan for Moldova, and has presented it a few weeks ago. 1.8 billion euros are to be implemented in Moldova in the next 3 years. It's in fact is double as Macedonia, Northern Macedonia receives. 1.8 billions. It's an amount of support that Moldova has still to absorb, but it's actually it complements the gap, because we are, even though in the accession process negotiations, we know that the pre-accession funds will be available only in 2028. And I think this economic growth plan of 1.8 billion will provide a very good, replacement for funds which were not there yet, or not will be there yet for us until 2028. Also, given the calendar, because the calendar for accession negotiations discussed in Brussels and Chisinau is very ambitious. 2028 should be the year when Moldova should finalize negotiations of accession. To embark on the opportunity of the political commitment also made by the President of the European Commission, that this commission will be an enlargement commission. We have a president that just has been elected with that mandate to make sure that by 2030, Moldova is part of the European Union. So yeah, I mean, we all will have to continue to explore, avenues and opportunities, how to improve further our resilience, how to outreach and address the vulnerabilities, and how together work on the path to the European Union. Because at the end of the day, that would provide us more, stability, more prosperity, development.
Thank you, Julian. Great. Elena, maybe very shortly, because I also want to open the floor. So to go back to my initial question, is the EU really acting geostrategically in the neighborhood? What would be your take?
I'll be very brief, Mariam. And I think that geopolitical powers are not only judged by their successes in particular countries, but also judged by their failures of their foreign policy. And I think it really casts significant doubt on the credibility of the EU as a foreign policy actor, especially in relation of such a small country like Georgia, where more than 80% of its citizens support European integration. And I think to zoom out and to talk about this geopolitical context in which accession and democracy support is taking place, we are witnessing now the shaping of the EU's new leadership, and where we have not seen democracy support being as prominent and high priority in this particular commission. So I think it's also very important that we speak about this dimension, that in general, the European Union should make a significant priority of supporting democracy and supporting democracy through the enlargement process. And one sentence about the contrasting parallels about Moldova and Georgia, and Julian very well outlined the support that Moldova has received from the European Union. We're talking about very different partnerships here. When we talk about EU's relations with Moldova, and Julian very well outlined that there was a civilian mission established to fight against the hybrid threat and strengthen the security architecture of Moldova. And when it comes to Georgia, we were talking about different partnership. It's not that the European Union was supporting Georgia in this particular process to protect itself from Russia's interference in elections, but the very problems we're talking about Georgia's election were internal. The irregularities we have discussed, the threats when it comes to disinformation. In the last decade, increasingly what we have seen is that Georgian Dream and Georgian officials amplify the disinformation that Russia-backed agents are also spreading very well in the region and in the country. So when it comes to what kind of measures can come and what kind of support can come from the European Union, I think it's very time while European Union is applying more for more principle with Georgia or with Moldova, because of its success and progress on the democratic reforms, also use the tools that Giselle very well outlined in the previous section with the less for less principle with Georgia, because what we are seeing, and this is very well outlined in the enlargement, the latest enlargement report, is that the steps backwards on democracy and democratic reforms in the country. Thank you, Mariam. I stop here.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Giselle, would you like to comment before I open the floor? Or should we leave your comments for the conclusion of the event? Okay, perfect. Then I would like to invite our guests to raise their hands. There is a function, raise the hand function, which you can use, and I will give you the floor immediately for any comments and answers. And sorry, I forgot actually, before I do that, I think Georgi Christovani is in the room. He is the research director at PMCG in Tbilisi. And I'd actually very much like to give him the floor to give his views as well. Does that work? Now it should work. And your video should also work if you'd like to. Okay, perfect. Thank you,
Mariam.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mariam. Thank you, Elena, Giselle, Julia, for very interesting inputs. And let me also briefly highlight the situation and the context from Georgia. So first of all, I would say that the sum of evidence which Elena highlighted suggests kind of a more systematic character of potential manipulations. And I think it's something new, even for Georgia, because we are used to very more like approaches where everything was much more evident in the past, and at the same time not so well organized and not so systematically organized. And that's why at this point it's quite hard to, let's say, blame the ruling party, because you need to not only bring one or two arguments, you need maybe 1 or 2 hours to bring together all the points and kind of make clear how systematically it has been manipulated. And I think that in this regard, it's very important to, from the EU side, to require kind of a more systematic inquiry or investigation in order to understand what really happened. And I think that before, usually, as Giselle mentioned, the observers previously observed, who observed Georgian elections, were mainly was focusing: is it violent? Are there some mass manipulation efforts very visible for everybody? And if it's not the case, okay, this is more or less okay then, because we can't see anything that is so obvious that we need to state and it immediately. And I think everybody was prepared for this kind of observation. And so the level of manipulation, if it happened very precisely and very systematically. And for this, that's why without real high quality independent investigation, it will be very difficult to prove anything. And I think that the argument what might EU bring is that if we are talking about EU candidate country, EU expects the quality of elections with EU standards, and if it's not the case, requires really very detailed investigation with full access to any information required for this kind of investigation. And if it won't happen, we'll struggle to recognize the results. And at this point, I'm more or less missing this intensity of requirements. It's more like business as usual. And of course, it's understandable that also the current government and ruling party is offering also this kind of business as usual approaches. We will count the and we will count the document. And that's why I think it won't help anybody. And that's why I think it's more important for EU to be more precise what kind of evidence will help EU to recognize and legitimize the elections. And second aspect, what I want to highlight is that what will happen if this kind of requirements from EU side about the investigation will not succeed, and the government refuses to, because somebody mentioned that it should happen that the government invites EU to do so, and if it won't happen, what will happen then? And I think everybody who cares about Georgia and Georgian democracy should also parallelly think how to maintain in Georgia this ecosystem of democracy, I would call so, because this is political parties, those are civil society organizations, those are foundations, those are international organizations present in Georgia. These are academia, universities, which now are really under a big threat to be left alone in Georgia with the ruling party, which has announced formally and was very vocal what is the strategy of this party towards universities, towards non-governmental organizations, towards opposition parties. And that's why I think it's very important for EU and people in the EU to understand and then to find ways how we can support this let's call it civil society and political parties in order to survive. Because at this point, everybody in Georgia requires from political parties to not to enter parliament. And they announced that all four parties will not do so. But we all need to understand that if it happens, and I think this is the absolute minimum what we need in Georgia in order to not legitimize the current elections. Georgian political parties, opposition political parties, but at the same time, Georgian civil society is very much under threat, and EU might be the maybe only big actor who might find ways how to support and make this ecosystem survive. Because Georgian democracy, fortunately, relied a lot on the strength of civil society. And I think the first target of ruling party, if it ruling party will be delegitimized from EU side, would be Georgian civil society and this whole ecosystem. And that's why these are two, I guess, more very important steps. First, require real detailed investigation in order to legitimize the elections, and only EU can do so because we are EU candidate country. And the second is find ways to make Georgian civil society survive. And I mean civil society, not only civil society organizations, but also universities, foundations, political institutions as well. Because I assume, left alone in a country where the government is not legitimized from its partners, makes the civil society kind of hostage of the situation, and it needs massive support from abroad. I will stop here, Maria.
Thank you very much, Georgi, for this very clear messages. Now we have a bit over 15 minutes for any other comments and questions to our panelists. Please just raise your hand by the raise hand function.
Mariam, there is also a question in the chat.
Yeah, let me see. Okay, there's a question from Jorn Eichhorn, sorry. Can Georgia ever become a member of the EU without having first resolved the relationship with Russia? And what could the letter look like? Thank you, Jorn. Who would like to pick on this one?
I could start, Mariam, on this one. I think Georgia is not the only country that has challenges, let's say so, and the Russian interference when it comes to its managing its foreign policy directions. And a good example of advancements on the EU integration path and EU accession path is the one coming from Ukraine and Moldova. At the moment, Ukrainians are fighting to defend their country. They are in the war, brutal war with Russian Federation, and then we have also Moldova that is fighting to advance and progress on democratic path, while there is a Russian interference also happening in the country. And we see that these countries are not judged when it comes to on their integration path, what kind of relationships they are having with Russia, but they are judged based on the progress that they are making on the democratic path, because this is a critical issue when it comes to EU accession, and this is what the European Union, the Commission, and the EU member states are looking at within the framework and the priorities that were defined by the European Commission. So my answer would be yes, and we also should not talk about EU enlargement and accession process that will happen immediately. It will take at least a decade to advance these countries. Of course, there is a desire and will from Ukrainians, Georgians, and Moldovans that the process happens as soon as possible. But we all know that the requirements, the chapters, and the progress on the path of the democratic process and the alignment with the EU acquis takes a lot of time. So it won't be happening immediately, but the judgment and the critical issue here won't be about this country's relationship with Russia, but how fast and committed they are to their progress and democratic reforms. Thank you.
Julian, yes,
Let me
please.
just add something. I think it's already time that we understand that our countries have their own agencies. We're not in-betweeners. I think we should care more about what our people think and what our people do than what Putin does or others does. Really, I mean, we don't have the comfort to be, Germany or France or other countries in the EU or even NATO members that can, benefit from, security umbrella, but also, the benefit of being part of the Western community. We are here very vulnerable and fighting for our future. And I think we will be helped as much as we can help us. And I think if someone proved that, I think it's Ukraine. I mean, if Ukraine wouldn't fight, nobody would fight for them. If we wouldn't fight, we as citizens in Georgia or in Moldova wouldn't fight for our future and understand our own agency, and will not stop others to talk over our heads, we will not succeed. So I think it's time that we understand that our countries have their own agency. And I think what Moldova proved is if you invest in resilience, if you invest in the effort of reaching out to communities, to citizens, if you build up institutions that are free from corruption, that are more efficient, if you get support, if you are credible to your international partners, if you are trustable, then you can succeed. If you don't, you will stay ambivalent, you'll stay floating in the ocean without clear direction, and from some time to time having different winds bringing you to the west or to the east. So I think it's time that we understand that, and I think we all should do that. I mean, Ukrainians, Georgians, Moldovans, everyone here in the region should do more efforts and explain that to the decision makers in various capitals in EU or over the Atlantic or even Moscow. We have our own agency, and we need to make sure that people understand that, and that will be the answer to all these questions. That ask us what you think that will happen if Russia does that or that. I don't care.
Giselle, would you like to reflect on that as well?
Maybe very, very briefly. I think this is a very important point. I think it can't be said, more often, Julian. I think that's very, very important. But I also think that say the EU, but also NATO and the US have a certain responsibility here as well. And I think that to expect enlargement, merit-based enlargement, this is all good and fine. But I think if the security dimension is completely ignored, and I think that I think the EU doesn't really have it. I think they do geopolitics with a small G, but not with a capital G. I think if there was a real geopolitical commitment, there would be much stronger security guarantees, and I think there would be much stronger effort. I would think also to help Ukraine, win the war, or at least not to gradually lose it. And I think that responsibility and commitment also has to be there. And I'm missing this more and more. Also now, of course, with the uncertainties of the US elections, but also with the attention coming to the Middle East and North Africa. But I think it's a very short-sighted strategy, also for European security, and that dimension, because it's also about the EU security. It's about Europe's security architecture, and I think what at the moment the EU is, the geopolitics are not particular threat, I think, to the Russian Federation. If anything, I think it looks fairly weak for the time being, and I don't think that really helps in the Georgian context. I also don't think that it helps in the Moldovan context. But yeah, please add.
I debate on you on that, because I would agree. I would have agreed with you totally 2.5 years ago. Today, I would say that things changed. I think a lot of leaders in the West have understood that avoiding to face and stop Russia from meddling will not stop Russia to interfere. So I think what was clear is that the fact that Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia were not ready to join the EU for some time in Europe. I remember December 2021 Eastern Partnership Summit, when all 3 countries were demanding, give us a European perspective. It was a few months before the war started. Everyone basically were close to the moment to understand that the war would start, even though it was not clear for all. No, EU is not ready, you're not ready. The war started, many things have changed. Not only in terms of the approach on the security or enlargement, things have changed. And I think also, when you look today at the new European Commission, you have 2 important figures: a commissioner for defense, which was not the case a few years ago. We have a high rep who perfectly understands much better, even what means Russia and how to deal with that from a small country like Estonia, that I'm sure is much more resilient than Georgia or Moldova and Ukraine is, in the sense, that built that in time. So my point is that I think things are changing. And also with the elections in the US, we hear already for some time that Europe is talking about its strategic autonomy. I think this is something which becomes more and more important, and we heard yesterday's statements made on the European political community of the leaders in Europe. So I think this is where we're going, and of course we want and we need you to be more serious and more courageous in accepting the role of being a geopolitical actor and addressing the vulnerabilities in the region with engagement, not with restraint.
Okay, I think this is a very big discussion and a very important and interesting one. It is a big question. Yes, we have a commission now we will have commissioner for defense, but what really be his mandate, and what will be his influence? That's quite I would say questionable, and it's true what you said, but I think it's also, we have to remind ourselves that in Ukraine we're slowly losing ground. So yes, all these great developments, strategic autonomy discussions, but It's not entirely clear to what extent our actions are where our mouth is, I think. But anyways, that was just a side comment. There are two other questions in the chat function. I will actually read them. So the first one is from an anonymous person. Would you argue that there is a risk of the situation with Moldova and Transnistria to worsen due to the results of both the referendum and the presidential elections? And if so, what do you believe is the best approach for the EU to respond to the phenomenon, given that Moldova is a candidate status? I guess that is a question to Julian. And there is another question. When it comes to the Balkan countries' accession to the EU, there are different opinions on whether it is better to join most of the countries together or to join them individually. And in case of Georgia, do you think this is better to follow the strategy of joining with Ukraine and Moldova, or to evaluate each country individually? Perhaps Elena and Giselle could reflect on this question. Thank you.
Shall I start? Because I think it was one question about Transnistria, right?
Yes, please, Julia.
Well, if you look at the election, I don't see a direct link between the elections. I mean, if you judge on the elections, I'm not sure there is a direct link with how the conflict settlement process will evolve or not, because I mean, looking at the results, 37% of citizens from Transnistrian region have voted for European Union. Well, not the whole, not the entire population of the region participated, but those who wanted to participate, they had the ability to participate in the elections. And 37% of them voted for Moldova being part of the EU. In Gagauzia, which is an autonomous region in Moldova in the south, or even some cities in the country, the support for the EU was much lower. So elections is not the same as with the presidential elections results. Yes, there was no majority vote for the president Sandu, but still about 30% of the population voted for Sandu. And not in the case of Gagauzia, we had almost 98% voted for the candidate Stoyanoglu. Well, it may be also because of his ethnicity, that he's also from Gagauzia, but not necessarily, because we know that the region has been very much anchored in the Russian sphere of influence, and that was exploited for some time. But coming back to Transnistrian region, I think what we learned over the last 10 years since Moldova signed the association agreement and made sure that the agreement is applicable also in Transnistrian region, the economic integration component actually helped to bring the region closer to the rest of Moldova and to the West. Before the war, 75% of the exports were going from the region to the European Union. All the businesses from the region do business with the EU. It's because they had to register as Moldovan companies, and they went into the legal framework of Moldova. 99% of the citizens of the Republic of Moldova in 10 years, 99% of the residents of Transnistrian region got Moldovan passports and IDs. They got in 2014, when we got visa-free travel to the EU, we had about 30,000 of citizens from the region having the passports. Now all 335 hundreds of thousands of citizens have Moldovan passports. That is another element of reintegration. Now, with the war, what we have seen is that the elites in the region, which are business elites basically, there is a sheriff group, which is a company governing the region, and counterbalancing in a way the Russian presence there, because Russia has its own presence there. They're not always on the same terms. The elites in the region, they try to balance somehow between Russia and us, and try to use all opportunities to try to, to get more of this non-recognition, because the non-recognition actually of the region, or it provides them kind of an opportunity to benefit from these offshore types of instruments that they use. But with the war, the signal from the region was that very clearly, both to Ukraine and to Chisinau, was that we are not a threat to you. We don't want the war to escalate. They have distanced them as much as they can because of the business interests. And actually, the relations between Chisinau and Tiraspol, even though we didn't have 5+2 talks, which was the format of negotiations, or other types of negotiations, already for many years, Chisinau and Tiraspol talked in a more pragmatic manner, with the main task to preserve peace and stability and security, and using the independency, like buying electricity from one of the biggest power plants generators from the region, and the region now basically getting all the goods through Moldova because the border with Ukraine is closed. So there is a huge interdependency here. And people understand that more and more. With the war, the rockets are flying much closer to Tiraspol than to Chisinau. And bombs are going down much closer. And people there understand what are the threats and from where they're coming. And there is a huge shift in this context. So the further accession negotiations would provide even more opportunities of investment, of development, of rapprochement. Yes, we have a lot of work to do because the region has to approximate, legislation institutionally with the EU acquis, which was not the case now. This is a long process it will take. In any ways, we'll have transitional periods for that. But more important is that today Chisinau is upgrading its reintegration policy, prioritizing policy interventions which would help reintegrating the country, and getting ready for a moment when the critical mass will be created and the reintegration will start to take more speed. But of course, there is the war that is happening. The way how the war will end will impact also indirectly. They will impact as well, the speed and the quality of the settlement process in Transnistria region. But I think the integration process, the accession process with the EU would provide even more opportunities because economic integration is the key counterbalancing factor to threats coming from Russia. And today, the region is very much dependent on Russia. The main pillar of dependency of Russia is gas supply.
Mm-hmm.
And now, actually, we will see how we will solve this issue because Ukraine and Russia is not prolonging the transit contract. And the region will become even more dependent on Chisinau decisions, how to make sure that the people in the region benefit from energy and electricity and so on and so forth. So I think we also have a lot of responsibility in this process, but this is also providing opportunities to make it clear. If Russia would stop supplying gas to the region, Russia would lose its own key tool of influencing its role in the region. If they will do that, okay, we will dare and take that challenge and make sure that we will provide more opportunities for integration. We will do it by ourselves. I'm not sure. We need support. We need to work together. But I think it will provide opportunities.
Thank you very much, Julia. We are actually already over time, but I'd still like to give the floor to Giselle and Elena because there was a question about group versus individual accession, and that I think very much links to the big question of merit-based versus geopolitical enlargement. So if you'd like to reflect on them as concisely as you can, that would be much appreciated. Thank you.
I can start. I think the European Union currently has both approaches, regional approach, but merit-based advancements with particular countries. And this is very visible in terms of Western Balkans enlargement process, accession process, and EU's Eastern enlargement. If we are talking about EU's Eastern enlargement, we're talking about 3 countries, but we have seen that because Georgia was not ready in terms of its political commitment to advance on democratic reform agenda, we have seen that European Union first provided candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova, and Georgia had to wait to fulfill the recommendations provided by the European Commission. And now we see that the officially accession talks have been opened with the 2 countries, with Ukraine and Moldova. And we know that with the latest enlargement report, there is no such prospect for Georgia because most of the areas related to democratic reform agenda has experienced backsliding, not the progress in terms of advancements. So I think it has both, and but still provides the opportunities for individual countries to advance on this particular merit-based approach. And I think it's not mutually exclusive to have the regional approach, but then engage countries on particular state EU to particular government approach. And when it comes to your last question, Mariam, related to geopolitical and enlargement and merit-based enlargement, I think here we come to the same conclusion. We all know that the EU's latest enlargement wave, when it comes to EU's enlargement eastwards, was driven mainly by geopolitical factors. But we also see that despite the fact that Ukraine is in the war and the situation is particularly challenging, we see that the Commission is still very strict about the reform agenda, about democracy in the countries, and this is very, very tangibly evidenced on the case of Georgia. There was for the moment detached from the association trio, while two countries have seen more progress and advancement on accession process. Georgia will only come back to this track when political will for democratic reform agenda is tangible and evidence. I'll stop here. Over to you, Giselle.
Okay, yeah, I think there is a lot to be said, of course, for this process to be merit-based, and that should also be, I mean, the main focus. But I think to bundle or to have countries join, as a group is, has proven to be more advantageous in some ways, because there's also, of course, always enlargement fatigue within the European Union. Even if there's geopolitical necessity, I'm afraid, I'm perhaps not as optimistic as Julian when it comes to this. But I think this enlargement fatigue is important, because if you have, this always quite intensive in terms of resources to take in new members, and I think that's for member states always a bit difficult to digest. So I think if there's groups of countries joining, and I think there shouldn't be a distinction between whether that's now Western Balkans or any kind of defined idea of Eastern Europe, whatever that may be. So it's that maybe we shouldn't do, but rather have groups of countries that are roughly ready around the same time, but then really bundle them in a larger group to make sure that the EU also can digest this at once, because it has proven to be much more effective and also helps to counter this enlargement fatigue. But I think overall, I would say I think the main issue for now is for the EU not to lose interest or momentum in this enlargement process. And I think the Western Balkans, we have seen very, very clearly that at some point you can make a whole population that once used to be quite enthusiastic about EU membership also lose hope and lose trust in the credibility of the enlargement process if this perspective just never seems to materialize. And there are always member state domestic interests that are then in the way. And I think that should be the priority to keep the momentum for the time being. So and hopefully that will work. And I'll go then with Julian's more optimistic vision that member states do recognize the urgency of geopolitics.
Thank you very much, Giselle, for all of that and for warning against losing the momentum for enlargement as well. Thank you to our brilliant speakers. I'd just like to add that all our panelists are actually also authors of our book on Future of Europe and Enlargement, published by Springer. It is actually about views from various capitals and from the candidate countries. So it's a very interesting book for those who would like to understand what are the national positions on enlargement from EU member states and candidate countries. I would very much wholeheartedly like to thank Georgi and PMC Georgia for supporting this event, for co-hosting it. Of course, to our own team at TEPSA, for making it possible, and to all of you who've taken time to attend and to send us questions and to listen in. Thank you very much, and hope we'll meet at other events.